Okay, well, I might turn off the slide and we'll get underway. Hi, my name's Lisa Folkes. I'm the Director of Employment at Social Ventures Australia. Thank you for joining one of our webinar series on towards an inclusive economy or inclusive recovery. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on we variously meet, where we have our feet and where many of us live, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this country wasn't ceded. And it's a particularly critical time to be thinking about the dimensions of recovery and disadvantage for First Australians. And I'll just, as a little promo for our next webinar, in fact, in our next webinar on 4th of June, we will be talking about what COVID-19 and the economic shock associated with it means for First Australians. So just a little introduction to Social Ventures Australia. Social Ventures Australia is a not-for-profit organisation, and we work with partner organisations to alleviate disadvantage and aim for an Australia where people and communities thrive. One of our key focus areas in Social Ventures Australia is employment, and we ask ourselves what can be done to improve access to employment for those who face labour market disadvantage, and not just access to any employment, but what can be done to make sure that the work they get meets their needs for income, for security, for learning and for a sense of purpose. And we're able to do that work, certainly in my team, because of the support of philanthropic funders. And in this particular area and in the program of work that we do in my team, I want to acknowledge Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, Macquarie Group Foundation and City Foundation, amongst the number of individual and other funders that help us do the things we're trying to do. So in terms of this this series and this webinar today, the economic crisis that we're in at the moment has been compared to the Great Depression, and we've seen estimates that nearly 1 million jobs have been lost since COVID-19 hit our economy, and even more people have lost hours, which is really important. It's not just unemployment, but it's people losing hours. What we heard in the last webinar that was presented by Jeff Borland was that these losses, this harm is not distributed evenly across the economy. And so the question we're asking ourselves in this series of webinars is, who are those people who face the brunt of the harm from this crisis? And what can be done to ensure that when we recover in a way that is fair and ideally advances equality rather than entrenching disadvantage or inequality. So one of the ideas that has been floated in the discussion about what we need to do to address the current economic crisis is the idea of a job guarantee. And I want to start by acknowledging that the idea of a job guarantee has many versions and there are many debates that sit around it. One of those debates is a debate about the role of a job guarantee in the macro economy. So particularly Professor Bill Mitchell at Newcastle University has talked about the need to move beyond a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So can we do both? Can we provide a right to dignified employment to all Australians? But what I want to say is that today, what we're trying to focus on is a smaller agenda, perhaps a programmatic response, and a programmatic response particularly to the immediate crisis of people who have either become unemployed or were unemployed prior to the crisis and now face a labour market that is significantly different. For the sake of this discussion, what I want to suggest to you, and you will see as we get going that this is an interesting and contested area, and my fellow panellists and I have had some interesting discussions already about what this all means. But I want to suggest that at the heart of the idea is the need to generate labour demand. So not just indirectly through economic stimulus or tax cuts or labour market reforms, but actually directly through generating work opportunities and tangible work opportunities for people who are unemployed. So to join me in this interesting discussion, I have two panellists, and I'll invite them to appear on the screen to manifest. Otherwise, I'll just be here by myself, which will be really, really boring and unfortunate for everyone. So I'm really pleased that I have today two experts in this field. So Peter Davidson is, I actually once heard Ross Gittins describe Peter Davidson as a living treasure for his wealth of knowledge about Australia's taxation and welfare system, and particularly its programs of its labour market programs. So Peter is an adjunct senior lecturer at the Social Policy Research Centre, and it's in that capacity that he's here today, and he advises both in his individual capacity, but also many of you will know him as a senior advisor to ACOS in these areas, but it's in that private capacity or public capacity with the SPRC that is here today. And then our other panellist is Shirley Jackson, who is a senior economist at Per Capita think tank. And so Per Capita has been really interesting in talking about the idea of a job guarantee, but also the idea of full employment and what that might look like in this decade and particularly in this contemporary setting. So what we're going to do is each of our panellists will make a short presentation. We might have a bit of discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments from participants in the webinar. Now, down the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A section, and what we'd ask you to do is type any questions into there, and we will try to catch them. Behind the scenes, my colleague Simon Crabb is trying to make it all look smooth, and we hope that we succeed in doing that, but forgive us if the technology gets away from us. So I'll start by handing over to Peter for a bit of a presentation on your thinking about a jobs guarantee.
Thanks, Lisa, and welcome everyone. I would like to acknowledge I'm meeting at least on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm speaking here as an adjunct senior lecturer at the Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW, and like to welcome any SPRC colleagues who are here today. I've conducted research on comparative employment participation policies or labour market programs in Australia, UK, Netherlands, Denmark and other places over a period of time. And that includes the last recession we had in Australia in the early 90s. Some of you, I'm guessing, will have been around in social policy or employment services at that time and remember the impact of that recession and how ugly it was. But I have to say, this employment crisis is unprecedented, even compared with that one. The true rate of unemployment has doubled in 2 months, from 5 to 10%, possibly more. There are 1.5 million people on the job seeker payment. A few months ago, there were 800,000. And there are 6 million people parked in the job seeker payment, the wage subsidy system, many of whom probably don't have jobs to return to. And one of my great concerns about this unemployment crisis is that, as in the past, we'll see a retrenchment of long-term unemployment, people out of paid work for 12 months or more. Even before COVID-19, there were 500,000 people on job seeker payment for over 12 months, mostly older people and people with disabilities. And prolonged unemployment has huge social and economic impacts, and we have to nip that in the bud this time. We failed really after the recession of the early 90s, and I'll come back to that. It's unlikely, in my view, that we'll have a quick bounce back to an unemployment rate of 5% or anything like it. There's too much unemployment, too much lost income, too much household debt, and too little international demand to drive the employment growth that we'd need. So I'd like to preface everything I have to say about jobs guarantees and other policies with this comment: we're not going to get unemployment down below double digits without a hefty public sector stimulus, because jobs will not be generated in other ways over the next year or so. And that includes traditional public stimulus, infrastructure projects, but also investment in human services to close some of the gaps in aged care, in disability services, and many other care services, which is much more likely to assist the people, particularly young people and women, who have lost jobs in services industries, because they're the ones that have been hardest hit this time round. However, the experience of the early 90s suggests to me that a job guarantee for all unemployed people, or for a subset of unemployed people, such as people who are unemployed long term, is not of itself the best way forward. What we need is to guarantee people who are at risk of prolonged unemployment, or people and those already experiencing it, the assistance they need to transition to secure ongoing employment. In many cases, that will be a subsidised job, and I don't downplay the importance of that. In other cases, it will be further education and training. In other cases, it will be demand-led approaches where employment services line up jobs with employers and then prepare and train unemployed people for those positions. At the same time, crucially, there's a need to dramatically expand the number of mainstream jobs, and I'm not referring to private sector jobs only there, in the public and private sectors, so that people have jobs, have opportunities available to them. So starting with first principles, there are two approaches to jobs guarantees. One is to try and generate ongoing jobs for whoever the target group is: unemployed people, long-term unemployed people, young people. The second approach is to provide subsidised jobs, publicly subsidised jobs, as a stepping stone or transition point into unsubsidised jobs for people. Now, there are a few issues with a job guarantee of the first kind, where ongoing jobs are subsidised. If that happens in the private sector, there's a risk of displacement of jobs because employers who are subsidised will be favoured in the market. If ongoing subsidised jobs are created in the public sector, it kind of begs the question, why don't you just expand programs in the public sector generally and generate jobs in that way? And advocates of ongoing subsidised jobs in the public and community sectors for unemployed people often argue, well, we can get around that issue by ensuring that the subsidised jobs are additional jobs, additional to the ones that would have been provided through normal or expanded public programs. One issue with that, though, is that those additional jobs can be of poor quality. And we've had many public sector job creation schemes in the past that were of the painting rocks white variety. And we don't want to go back there. And if you ramp up a jobs guarantee to offer places for example, the million or so people who will be long-term unemployed on job seeker payment within a year or so, then the quality of those jobs may well diminish. And it's also possible that if there's a separate class of jobs for people who were formerly unemployed, that a punitive element could creep into the design of these programs. And we've seen that in spades with the Work for the Dole program, which of course is the unpaid equivalent. One exception, however, is regions where there isn't any labour market. For example, remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island communities. There, those displacement issues don't really arise. Let's say instead we want to use large-scale subsidised employment as a stepping stone or transition point for unemployed people, and particularly people who would otherwise have limited chances in the labour market as it at present. People unemployed long-term, or perhaps people leaving school in the present to enter the present labour market. That would help a great number of people, especially those unemployed long-term, because their main problem in obtaining a mainstream job, a regular job, is not it's not their lack of skills or their characteristics. Their main problem is the lack of jobs, and in particular the lack of jobs that employers are going to offer them. Because once you've been out of paid employment for a year or more, you get selected out of job vacancies. And on the other hand, if you're subsidised into a job, many employers will use that subsidised position to trial a person who they wouldn't otherwise employ. And in addition to that, people obtain skills, contacts, references. They plug that gap in their resumes, and so it can really improve people's employment prospects. So wage subsidies could be offered on a large scale, either in the private sector, where it's typically about half of the wage that's paid, or in the public and community sectors, where it's typically 100% of the wage that's paid. The public sector schemes tend to be less effective because of that additionality requirement and the quality of many of the jobs in the past. But they have been found to help many of the most marginalised people in the labour market, people who've been perhaps unemployed for a long time, who wouldn't be considered by private employers. It can help them as a stepping stone to mainstream employment. And those jobs are called, those subsidised jobs have a name, they're called transitional jobs, and transitional jobs can work and can work at scale. And sometimes public sector job programs can work on a large scale for a wider range of people, such as the Future Jobs Fund in the UK in 2012, which increased the chances that participants would be in an unsubsidised job a year later by around 11%, which is not bad for a labour market program. So scaling up wage subsidies, especially for people unemployed long term, is a good idea. We should do that, provided we're targeting people who are unlikely to get jobs without the public subsidy, and provided they're very carefully managed to avoid abuse. And indeed, those wage subsidies can generate employment, create jobs, in the sense that they can bring forward recruitment decisions as the economy recovers from a downturn. What if we scale that up for everyone unemployed long term? Well, we tried that in 1993. It was called the Job Compact. It was introduced by the Keating government. Everyone unemployed for more than 18 months was guaranteed a 6-month job with a wage subsidy at around the minimum wage. And at that time, we'd just come through the recession we had to have, and there were 300,000 people long-term on New Start allowance. That scheme was expected to halve long-term reliance on New Start within its first year. The plan was to rely heavily on private sector wage subsidies, and that was supplemented by public sector wage subsidy schemes. But the private sector recovery was weaker than expected, and so there was insufficient demand for the private wage subsidies, and so the public ones were ramped up. There were 200,000 jobs created in the space of a year, very, very rapidly. And at the same time, the Keating government introduced what they called case management, where the idea was that local employment service providers would have the flexibility to design the best form of employment assistance for each person unemployed long term. Unfortunately, that flexibility was kind of swept away by the job guarantee, because the priority was to kind of slot everybody into those subsidised jobs. And the result of the rapid ramping up of 200,000 jobs was that the quality of those jobs rapidly declined. And so as a result, instead of reducing long-term unemployment by half in a year, it reduced it by about 20%. So it worked to a degree, but not as expected. And only about 1 in 3 transitioned to unsubsidised jobs within about 3 months or so of receiving that help. So the subsidies did improve people's prospects of unsubsidised employment. The private sector ones by a factor of probably over 20%, or 20 percentage points, I should say, and the public sector ones by up to half that. So they did have an impact. And even those small impacts, 10 to 20 percentage points, if that's sustained over a number of years, that can dramatically reduce prolonged unemployment, as well as giving people a wage and all of the other benefits that go with a period of 3 to 6 months in employment, and that shouldn't be understated. But then along came the Howard government. They did away with the Job Compact, did away with the CES, ramped up case management instead, but in a new framework. And the idea here was that we'll have competing non-government employment service providers who will be performance managed, paid to outcomes to achieve the best possible employment outcomes for people at the lowest possible cost. Now, if the idea of a job guarantee for everyone unemployed long-term was a little bit naive, the job network was very naive, because what happened was the system relied on providers to take risks, to patiently invest in wage subsidies, training, and other substantial forms of help that are typically needed by people unemployed long-term, in the hope of picking up more outcome payments. In fact, what happened was the system encouraged them to be risk-averse because they could survive and thrive typically by investing in low-level job search assistance, a bit of polishing of resumes and so on, and supervised job search, without having to risk those larger investments in more substantial help, exactly the things that people disadvantaged in the labour market actually needed. And so as a result, from 1991 to 2007, the period of our great employment boom, the number of people on New Start and other unemployment payments fell from 850,000 to 490,000, almost halved. The number of long-term recipients only fell from 300,000 to 290,000. So 2/3 of, in 2007 and even up until a few months ago, 2/3 of the people on unemployment payments were on them long term. And what that tells me is that, I'll have to wrap up, sorry, that the system was not working. So if our goal is to reduce prolonged unemployment or labour market disadvantage by providing a stepping stone to mainstream employment, we need to invest a lot more than we have in Australia in employment assistance programs, including subsidised employment for people who are otherwise unlikely to get a job. But I would suggest a jobs and training guarantee rather than a job guarantee per se, and I'd suggest that that be provided for people who are, predominantly for people who are unemployed long term, and that is backed by partnerships between government, employers, unions, employment services, and training providers at a regional level who are working together around a strategy to restore employment in that region. So you're ramping up assistance that's relevant to, that's embedded in that strategy. And at the same time, the employment service providers have enough flexibility to link people to whatever program of assistance works for them. It has to be more than the supervised job search and obsession with compliance that we have in our present employment service system. That won't work when there aren't enough jobs and people aren't going to be offered them. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. So look, we'll come back to some of those issues. I'm very conscious that we've got lots of participants on the line, and no doubt some of them would like to ask questions as well. So Shirley, I'll throw to you, and perhaps you can talk to us about, I mean, it's a slightly different conception, I think, of a jobs guarantee, but I'm no doubt there are some areas of commonality as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa, and g'day everyone. Thanks for being with us here today. Now, I tend to talk pretty fast and I've got a lot of information to get through, so I apologise in advance if I rip through too much. Please do pull me up in the questions if there's anything you're more interested in. So I did just want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you all from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as any other First Nations elders who might be in attendance with us today. This is land that was stolen, never ceded, and I acknowledge that this is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, I'm here today to talk to you all about why I think that we need a youth guarantee, and I think there are two important parts to this idea. The first question that you might be asking is, why young people? Why not older workers, retrenched workers, regional workers, or long-term unemployed workers? My answer to that is yes, all of those things. Everybody needs particular attention. Different groups will need different strategies. So this is not a youth guarantee that's ahead of all others or one that preferences young people above other demographics. Rather, it is a simple acknowledgement that young people face particular challenges in the labour market by the simple fact that they are always the most recent entrants to it. If the labour market has been shaped by a boom or a bust, or if there's been an expansion or a recession, these will have particular impacts for those of us who are trying to get onto the first rung of a very, very complex ladder. So we've talked about the youth part of this idea, and that leads me to address the second part, which is the guarantee part. Why should we try and guarantee young workers get specific assistance within the labour market? As we know, and as I mentioned before, when there are so many other people, why focus on giving young people a guarantee? So the answer is a little bit longer, and while the coronavirus crisis has negatively impacted young people across the board, the current crisis for me has just highlighted the fissures that were already a long-established part of the youth labour market. For young people in 21st century Australia, the transition from school to work has been defined by insecurity. In some senses, the school to work transition has always been characterised by these periods of instability, as new entrants to the labour market have always been expected to learn new skills, earn respect and prove their value before achieving long-term stability. However, the labour market deregulation policies of the 80s and 90s have contributed to young people in the 21st century remaining in precarious positions for far longer than their forebears, well into their late 20s and for some people well into their early 30s. Worse still, for those of us who entered the labour market after the millennium, there have been two major external economic crises within a decade. And while we've been trying to manage the already difficult twin transitions from student to worker and from child to adult, we're also trying to navigate an incredibly insecure labour market. So the latest data from the HILDA survey, the Households Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, finds that young workers are the most likely age group to be in non-standard employment relationships, with more than half of workers aged between 15 and 24 being employed through casual contracts. While 3/4 of casual workers in this demographic are also studying at the same time, there is a troubling rise in insecurity for those who have graduated. Over 40% of workers aged 25 to 34 were employed in casual, fixed term or part-time arrangements. And that is in spite of the fact that the latest generations of Australians are the most highly educated in our history. The number of young Aussies with a bachelor's degree has risen from approximately 3% of 15 to 24-year-olds and 10% of 25 to 34-year-olds in 1983 to 11% and 40% respectively. That's a quadrupling of educational attainment in my lifetime alone. Worse still, the latest HILDA survey data shows that graduate wages are shrinking over time. For those who graduated between 2006 and 2009, the average weekly wage was $947.31 in change in the first year of their graduate employment. For those who finished university between 2012 and 2013, that figure has shrunk to $791.58. That's adjusted for inflation. Arguably, the declining rates of wages and employment opportunities for young workers have been driven by a skills underutilisation within the Australian economy. Almost 1 in 3 undergraduates employed full-time said that they were working in a job that did not fully utilise their skills or education because there were no appropriate jobs available. That's from the Graduate Outcomes Survey. So All of that is before the crisis hits. You don't have to be a stats junkie to guess which industries have been hardest hit by this crisis. You just have to walk down the high street of your town. As consumption habits change in response to the health crisis, many industries that employ young workers have shrunk or been closed entirely, notably fast food, hospitality, retail, and the arts. For all of these industries, more than 40% of their workforce is under 24. Yet despite governmental intervention designed to retain staff, young workers have overwhelmingly been pushed into even more precarious positions within the labour market. While the traditional measures of labour market attachment have increased between March and April of 2020, with unemployment rising by almost 2% and underemployment, so the number of people who are working part-time but would choose to work more hours if they could, has increased by 5%. The real growth has come from young workers dropping out of the labour market entirely. So usually the number of people outside the labour market remains relatively constant, fluctuating within a few fractions of a percentage or maybe a couple of percentage points here or there. But since March, the number of young people who are either looking for work or had been in employment, however insecure, has fallen by 11%. So when we add together the unemployment rate, that underemployment rate, and there's additional loss of labour market attachment of more than 200,000 young workers, we get a true underutilisation rate that is more than 50% for the first time since the Great Depression. That means 1 in 2 young people does not have enough work to survive. So I hope by now that you're starting to see why I think that we can justifiably talk about the need for a youth guarantee, something that guarantees something for young people. These are not the low-skilled, long-term, unemployed, unambitious, and lazy youth that some of the headline-grabbing articles might have you believe. There are literally hundreds of thousands of good kids who have been doing what they were supposed to do: go to uni, work a job to support themselves, and try and find a career. So that leads us to ask, what should a youth guarantee look like? For me, it comes down to a number of key steps, but I'd first like to say what it isn't. It isn't work for the dull junior edition. A lot of these kids had jobs. They don't need to learn work skills. And a majority of them have been working in retail, fast food, or hospo since they were in high school. And it isn't just about creating a massive amount of low skill minimum wage jobs a la a traditional modern monetary theory approach, although I think that there's some merits in what we talk about in that approach, particularly the local focus, I think, is very important for regional workers, but we'll leave that to the side. I think there are a lot of young people, like quite a lot of young people out there, who would be very happy to take a job, whatever it is. And we definitely need to create some of those jobs for the types of people that need them. But I would argue that a youth guarantee should be more than that. It is a promise to mobilise our resources to utilise the skills and education that young people already have, and to give them the opportunity to put them to good use for our economy. A youth guarantee is the promise that anyone under a certain age, whether that's 20, 24, or even 30, will be offered a job, a place in a training program that has a good chance of getting them a job, or a paid placement that might lead to a job. So how can we do that? In order to build an economy that works for young people, the government will need to be bold in the face of this crisis. Young workers will need a range of supply and, most importantly, demand-side strategies to recover from this crisis. I think that there are 5 key areas that can contribute to a youth guarantee, and that's direct employment, social procurement, vocational education and training, redistribution of work, and study payments. So first, direct employment. We need immediate expansion of the government graduate programs. Currently, the federal government's graduate program offers less than 1,400 entry-level positions across the entire range of federal departments, independent commissions, and statutory authorities, making up little more than 1% of the total ongoing employees of the Australian Public Service. If the government expanded the graduate program to 2% of total ongoing employment by offering an additional 1,247 odd jobs across a range of disciplines and departments, the government could build capacity in key recovery areas, notably in the departments of health, agriculture, industry, innovation and science, infrastructure, transport, cities and regional development, and environment and energy, and provide additional stimulus into the economy. By investing in the departmental graduate programs alone, the government could inject an additional $175 million into the economy through graduate wages, including a return of about $34 million per annum in income revenue recuperated. Additionally, we need to remove the employment caps currently placed on federal departments. Not only does it slow down the progression upwards through the career path, but it has encouraged a reliance on that short-term contracting, outsourcing and insourcing of jobs that could be done by graduates and other entry-level workers. This would have a huge impact for generalists in the governmental departments, but also specialists who could be employed by the CSIRO. They're currently subjected to this employment cap too. And they could be employing people across a range of high skill occupations in science, engineering and mathematical sciences, as well as giving us greater opportunities for innovation and advanced manufacturing that comes out of the important research that they do. Secondly, social procurement policies should be an essential part of any recovery plan, in my opinion, as it maximises the benefits to the Australian workforce and the Australian economy. Local content requirements in combination with apprenticeship, traineeship and cadetship ratios hold the potential to maximise the employment opportunities for young workers in the recovery period. Large-scale infrastructure projects are a very, very common way to invest in any crisis, and I'm sure that the government is mobilising all of its resources to try and pump out those big projects. But unless it's focused on job creation and targeted economic stimulation, it won't really have the benefit that we want. And for young workers, there's no guarantee that the jobs created will be shared equally across the age demographics. And recently, apprenticeship numbers have been dropping across Australia. Data collected by our friends at the Global Apprenticeships Network, and I think I saw Gary's on here, so big shout out to Gary for all the fantastic work that he and his colleagues do. GAN have shown that the crisis has cut the number of apprenticeships being advertised by almost 75%. Construction-related trades, which are the most popular industry for apprenticeships traditionally, have seen vacancies halve in the 12 months before the crisis. So if the government wants to invest in the economy and reduce economic scarring or the long-term impacts of economic disadvantage for young workers, procurement policies should be implemented that guarantees an increase in apprenticeships, in traineeships and in cadetships, not just in prime contractors, but in the supply chain and the subcontractor arrangements that come with working on any project for a big government tender. So if we ensure that at least 1 in 10 workers specifically is an entry-level position, either an apprenticeship, a traineeship or a cadetship, the government could give young workers a pathway into sustainable careers in construction, manufacturing and other allied industries. Now for VET. Since we know that young people are already highly educated, why should we bother investing anything in skills or training? And the answer is that we need to address the hollowing out of the labour market and the arrest the decline in intermediate or technical skills across the economy. So a recent review of the skills profiles of the OECD, which is all the major quote unquote advanced economies of the Western world traditionally, has found that Australia is ranked 8th in the proportion of workers with high skills, so those with tertiary education above a Certificate 3. But we ranked 29th in the proportion of workers with intermediate skills. So that's people who've completed year 12 all the way up to having a Certificate 3. And then we're 16th in the proportion of workers with low skills. So those who did not complete year 12. So in other words, what that means is while we have the highest number of law graduates in our history, at the same time, we have nationwide shortages in the automotive trades from panel beaters through auto electricians, as well as shortages in midwifery and metal trades like boilermakers and welders. This low ranking for the intermediate skilled workforce points to the need for investment in vocational education and training. So it ensures that our domestic capabilities are in equilibrium with our economic needs. Now, Victoria and New South Wales have already announced that priority courses will be offered fee-free through their public TAFE institutions, and that they will be linked to ongoing and planned industry projects across aged care, construction, healthcare and manufacturing. But we need to make sure that those things are targeted towards where we know we have demand in skills.
Now, Shirley,
so the federal government should...
We're going to need you to wrap up so we can get at least a couple of questions in.
I'm getting to my last 2 points. I'll whip through them. So I've already talked about VET, but you know, I think that's a really important thing to make sure that there aren't any financial barriers to get into new training. Fourth, we needed redistribution of work. So somehow in our society, we've ended up with this crazy situation whereby we have some people who are out of work and have very little work, and then we have a bunch of other people at the other end who are grossly overworked. Our friends at the Australia Institute conducted a survey of working hours in 2016, I think, and found that full-time workers put in an average of 5 hours unpaid overtime every single week. That's an average of 5 hours. We know that working longer hours has a negative impact on not only the economy, but also on our mental health. A recent study out of the ANU analysed the Hilda survey and found that working beyond 39 hours a week increasingly puts people at risk of developing mental health problems. Yet average Australian full-time working hours currently stand at about 42.28 hours a week. The imbalance of overwork is linked to the suffering and dislocation of underemployed and unemployed workers, a large proportion of whom are under the age of 25. By moving incrementally to a shorter working week, say 35 hours a week over the medium term, so 4 to 5 years, a gradual reduction in the working week would ensure that no worker suffers a drop in their take-home pay. Each year, we could be reducing the full-time working hours by half an hour or an hour a week, while modestly increasing wages to cover the cost of increased costs of living. And this long phasing would allow businesses to plan and adjust accordingly, and we could maintain living standards without a loss of income. Finally, we need to try and keep the study allowance payments somewhere close to the crisis levels to ensure that not only will people who are locked out of work during the long tail of this economic crisis be able to live a life of security and dignity, but also to ensure a broad demand base within our economy that will help with our recovery. Currently, youth allowance is $50 less than the previously called New Start allowance, and it's, I think, approximately about $233 per week below the Henderson poverty line. So there should be no doubt that youth unemployment figures that will plague Australia for the next 12 to 18 months will be a direct result of the crisis, and not because young people aren't looking for work. I've probably spoken far too long, but I hope that you see we need a range of strategies to make sure that young people aren't unfairly punished in the wake of this crisis. And I reckon we need a youth guarantee. And if we don't invest right now, our economy might never recover. Thanks so much to everyone for listening to me go over time, and I really look forward to your questions.
So I'll get Peter to come back on, but I'm also going to throw to Alex McLean, who's the Joint Director of the National Youth Commission. They've just been conducting an extraordinary public inquiry into young people's employment and transitions, and I'm hoping we can get Alex up to respond, particularly to some of those thoughts on young people. We unfortunately only have 10 minutes left, and I did want to at least try to have a crack at a couple of questions. But Alex, thank you. Welcome.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Shirley and Dave, Peter and Shirley and Lisa. I felt like I've learned a lot in that session. So hi everyone, my name is Alex McLean and I'm one of the co-executive officers at an organisation called the National Youth Commission of Australia. And for the past 18 months now, we've been doing an inquiry into youth employment and transitions, going across the country, holding public hearings and focus groups to figure out what are the challenges and solutions in this area. I really only have one comment, and that's something that I'd like to reflect on that actually happened a few nights ago on Monday. So I'm not sure if anyone caught the Q&A episode, but it was actually on young people and COVID-19. And one of our youth commissioners, Sophie Johnston, was on the episode. So she was the only young person on the panel out of the 5-6 people that were on there. I remember at one point, one of the questions was asked by a recent arts graduate, Natasha, who asked, I'm a recent art graduate, I just lost my form of employment. What advice would you give to me? And it was very interesting to see the advice that was given by the older people on the panel and the disengagement you saw in Natasha's face, because the kind of rhetoric was like, oh, there will be jobs in this industry or plenty of jobs in healthcare or XYZ. So, and you could see that as this was going on, she was becoming quite disengaged. She was like, what does that actually mean for me now, though? I've gone through this degree. I have it now. Are you telling me that I should have done something completely different? It was Sophie who jumped in on the panel and said, look, I think we're all missing the point here. Like, we're putting all the onus on this young person and not talking about the bigger systems at play that have led to this. So the only thing that I would add, and it's something that we have learned extensively through our consultations with young people, that it's really critical that you listen to them and you include them in the discussions that you're having. We have learned a lot from our inquiry and we're really excited to start publishing it. But yeah, it became very prevalent in that episode that all the questions that were asked, they weren't really answered appropriately. It would have been really great to see more young people in that panel in that position to answer those questions. But that's the only thing that I really wanted to add is, yeah, to keep at the core of it, that the most important and critical thing you can be doing is centering young people.
Alex, Thank you so much for that, and it raises the elephant in the room, if you like, around advice to young people, to unemployed people, the sort of a support and assistance that's given to them that is really directed at fixing something wrong with them, when actually what's wrong is there aren't enough jobs. The jobs that are there are often don't give enough hours or use people's skills. And that's just got much, much worse and will stay much, much worse for a long time. So there is, and one of the reasons for this conversation is there is a need for a paradigm shift. We cannot continue to say, oh, this is just about poor information, poor job search, you know, lack of skills. It's actually about what's going on in the labour market. And as I think Peter mentioned right at the start, and Shirley also talked about, for the foreseeable future, the private sector will be working to try to restore what they've lost. I saw some recent stats about how many companies have already stopped trading through COVID-19, stopped trading. There is no prospect that jobs are going to magically appear. The only functions, the only organisations, the only way that we can provide something for people to look forward to use their skills, to allow them to contribute to our society, is if the public sector steps in, both directly and indirectly. And we know, I mean, that there are many worthwhile things. I heard what Peter said about the challenges around scaling, but there are lots of local governments, local organisations. The art sector has been smashed. You know, there are extraordinary opportunities for people to contribute. And I think that call that you have described, that disconnect between, hang on, here I am, I have something to offer, I've done everything you asked me to do, don't tell me to fill out another form or go to a meeting or do another resume, give me a job. That's the fundamental question that we're trying to understand and really trying to grapple with. So I guess I might take that as a springboard to ask our other panellists, where's the obligation on the rest of us? So there's a lot of obligation on people looking for work, you know, to do the right thing, to get all the right advice, to fill out forms. How will we enforce some sort of obligation? Where is the stick, if you like? I don't necessarily mean stick, but you know, how will we do something different with the labour market? And you know, just answer that in 5 minutes, because that's that'll be good. Peter, can I start with you?
Sure. Well, it's absolutely right that for a long, long time, so-called mutual obligations weren't all that mutual. They were all one way. It was self-help with a stick for unemployed people. Look, the ultimate sanction for governments is, of course, losing an election, and I don't think there's any doubt that the level of unemployment and hopefully the level of prolonged unemployment and the number of young people that that don't have work opportunities for years will be a major factor in the next election when it comes along. The government should be pressed to set targets to reduce unemployment, to reduce the share of unemployed people that that are out of paid work for a long time. And in the case of young people, that should be a lot less than 12 months, because you know, the impact is felt more, much more quickly, and it lasts. And secondly, some form of guarantee of assistance for people. And I would call it a jobs and training guarantee. But it's got to be much more than low-level job search assistants. And we need to put the wood on employers as well to retain existing jobs and to be open in their recruitment, not to freeze people out.
So I think that is one of the critical questions here when there's discussion about what can be done for business to help it regenerate, which is absolutely right. But there's also a question about where, what can be done. And one of the questions here was about de-risking small to medium enterprises and trying to give them whatever support they need to take people on that might need training or might need, might be their first job or they, just might need to learn on the job. So there's this question about what can be done on the private sector, but then also acknowledging the public sector. Shirley, sorry, I jumped in there.
Yeah, look, I think I agree with broadly what Peter was saying. For me, touching on some of the comments that Alex made, I think that the worst thing that can happen is for this to turn into another chapter in what I call the avocado wars, right? Like the generational wars of like old people telling young people to get a job and young people telling old people to stop having all the houses and the money, right? While that can make us feel like much better about our situation, we're not getting anywhere with that. And we need to realize that we're all being disadvantaged by this. And we all have a responsibility to hold our governments to account of whatever stripe and whatever persuasion and whatever level, whether that's local, state or federal, and ask that they do a better job. So I think that's definitely for all of us who are here today, or all of us who are ordinary citizens. From a government's point of view, they need to be, I don't think we should shy away from the stick. I think we hold out a lot of carrots and that there aren't a lot of sticks when it comes to our procurement policy. So I think that's an obvious point where we can exercise a little bit more power to get some better outcomes for the sorts of people that we're talking about. And also, just to echo what Alex is saying, fund youth groups to be involved in the policy making process when it comes down to it, or not just youth group, but people who are affected by it. We need far more democracy when it comes to our economic decision making. And we at Per Capita are taking that seriously. We have also been recipients of some help from the Lord Mayor's Foundation. We are going through some co-design work with some young people out in Sunshine in our first instance. And we're really looking forward to hearing from young people who might be disadvantaged or who might have particular skill sets that aren't being utilised, and hear about what they think they need out of the economy. I think that it's really bad whenever we make policy without including people who are affected by the policy. I think that's always a bad idea, and it allows policy making to be captured by vested interests.
So thank you, people. I'm looking at the time. I should say on the note of democracy that I've been seen in the Q&A and the chats that there's a bit of disappointment there wasn't more time for engagement. And what has been really clear in preparing for this webinar and through the course of it is there is a lot to talk about on this. So we have to leave it there. But it's an ongoing discussion, and I think it's one that certainly our organisation wants to continue to engage with people on. And I think Alex's point about the need to ensure that those people affected are asked, are not just told what's good for them, but actually placed at the centre of the agenda is absolutely critical. So look, thank you so much to our panellists, thank you to Alex, and thank you to participants. I'm sorry that we didn't get to more questions, but I hope that you will join us for our next webinar looking at First Australians. And I expect that many of you will want to be involved in an ongoing discussion about youth guarantee, but the broader agenda of how we come out of this economic crisis a better and fairer country that allows all of us to contribute in a way. Oh, Shirley.
I just wanted to plug one of our seminars. We've got an anniversary of
got a book,
the white paper coming up on the 29th of May. Please go to www.percapita.org.au to find out more, or you can find us on Twitter. I'm at AsinTemple, or Per Capita's at Per Capita.
Geez, there's always one. Thank you, guys. Have a lovely afternoon, and look forward to talking with you further
Thanks so
about
much,
this issue.
everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.